Okay, let's unpack this. We've got, well, a really fascinating set of sources today. We're going deep into Bhagavad Gita chapter 13.
Yeah, this chapter's got a pretty descriptive title, hasn't it? The yoga of the distinction between the field and the knower of the field.
Exactly. And that's our focus for this deep dive, isn't it? We're using
Yeah.
these, commentaries, related texts, even some notes on different translations.
Right. The goal is to really get a handle on these two core ideas. The field, kshetra, and the knower of the field, the kshejna.
Think of it as like a shortcut to understanding the basic building blocks of reality according to these texts, and crucially, where you fit into that picture.
Mm-hmm. We want to pull out the key takeaways, what these concepts mean, the path suggested for realizing the difference, and, well, why it matters so much, why it's presented as vital for self-knowledge and ultimately liberation.
And the sources we have are quite rich, aren't they? It's not just the verses themselves.
No, not at all. We've got explanations of those sometimes dense Sanskrit terms, plus some really helpful analogies and stories, things to make these ancient ideas feel a bit more relatable.
Definitely. So we'll explore what this field that we all experience actually is, what the nature of the knower observing it is.
And how understanding that difference, that relationship, is offered up as the way to, well, move beyond suffering.
Okay, so chapter 13, our sources mention its position in the Gita is significant, part of the Asi in Tet Femasi.
Precisely. Tat Temasi, that thou art, connects the individual taf with the total tat.
Yeah.
Chapter 13 really zooms in on the tafam part.
On the individual.
Yes, by analyzing what makes up the individual. And it does that by introducing these two fundamental components, kshetra and kshetrachna.
Right, so let's start there. Kshetra, the field. What exactly is the field based on these texts?
Okay, so the sources define kshetra as basically matter, the entire perceived world of objects, everything you can know, see, or experience.
Everything.
Everything objective. And it's described with three key characteristics. First, it's inert, no consciousness of its own. Second, it's always changing. And third, it's considered mithya.
Mithya, that means dependently real. Right, not independently existing.
Exactly. It's identified as apara prakriti.
Apara prakriti, that's the inferior nature from chapter 7, verse 4. Earth, water, fire, air, ether.
Mind, intellect, and egoism. Yes, the eightfold nature.
Right.
And this apara prakriti, the field, is pointed to in these texts as the root cause of samsara.
Samsara, the cycle of suffering, birth, death.
That whole cycle, yeah. And it's made up of the three gunasattva, rajas, tamas, and divided into those 8 factors we just mentioned.
So the field is essentially, well, everything we interact with, including our own bodies and minds.
That's a good way to put it. It's the whole domain of experience, the object side of the equation.
Got it. So if that's the field, the known, what about the knower, the Kshetrajna?
The kshetrajna is the opposing principle. It's the supreme consciousness, the pure knowing principle itself. The subject, the one who illumines the entire field.
And this is Paraprakriti, the higher nature.
Yes, the higher nature from Gita 7.5, the life element, as it's called there.
Okay.
And critically, the sources stress that this Paraprakriti is the essential nature of both the individual soul, the jiva, and the Supreme Lord Ishvara.
So it's the same fundamental nature.
That's the idea. It's described as aksara, indestructible, parama, limitless, avayava, not subject to modification, and sachitatmika, pure existence consciousness. That's the knower.
The field that's known and the knower that knows it. The sources use analogies for this, don't they?
They do, and they're quite helpful. Like, think of a driver driving a car, or a rider on a horse, or a swimmer in water.
Okay.
The point is, the status of being a driver or rider or swimmer only exists because of the interaction with that specific field, the car, the horse, the water.
Right. When they get out, they're just a person.
Exactly, a pure individual. Similarly, the knower seems to function within the field of the body and mind, but its real nature is distinct. It sort of gains the status of knower of the field because it's observing it, standing apart from it.
Like playing a role, but you're not the role itself.
Precisely. And the texts say it's this combination, this interplay of the two prakritis, higher and lower, conscious and inert, that allows Ishvara to function as the creator, sustainer, and dissolver.
Okay, so we had these two fundamental principles. What then is considered true knowledge, according to the Gita, based on our sources?
Well, verse 3 of chapter 13 spells it out pretty clearly. Krishna says, know that Satrajna the knower to be myself, obtaining in all bodies.
Myself meaning Krishna, the Supreme.
Yes. And then he says, that knowledge which deals with Kshetra the field and Kshetrajna the knower is true knowledge. This is my teaching.
So true knowledge is understanding this distinction and the connection between the individual knower and the supreme.
Exactly. It's knowing the field, knowing the knower, and recognizing that the knower in you is essentially the same as the supreme knower everywhere. It's not just knowing about things, but knowing the knower and the known.
That's quite a definition.
Hmm.
Okay, let's go back to the field, the kshetra. What are its specific parts, according to these texts?
So the sources bring in Sankhya philosophy and Gita, verses 6 and 7. They list 24 components, or tattvams.
24.
You've got the great elements, the Mahabhutas, earth, water, fire, air, ether, and these exist both subtly.
Subtle, like the cause behind the physical.
Yes, the subtle cause beyond sense perception, and then the gross form, which is what our senses actually perceive.
Right, the basic building blocks. What else?
Then you have egoism, intellect, and something called the unmanifested mula prakriti, or maya, or avidya.
The unmanifested.
It's described as the unseen causal state, like the total potential, the sum of all latent impressions, or vasanas, from which the entire manifest world arises.
Ah, so not just what is, but the potential for what can be.
Right. And then the 10 senses, 5 for perception, 5 for action, plus the mind.
Okay.
And finally, the 5 objects of the senses, sound, touch, form, taste, smell, basically what the senses perceive.
Wow, okay. That seems to cover, well, pretty much everything we experience. Does verse 7 add more attributes?
It does. Things like desire, icha, or raga,
Yeah.
hatred, dvesha, pleasure, sukham, pain, dukkam, the physical body itself, called the aggregate, intelligence, and fortitude, jati.
Now, you mentioned one source highlights a key difference here with other philosophies.
Yes, this is important. Some schools, like Nyaya Vasishika, apparently attributed things like consciousness, pleasure, pain, desire to the Atma itself, the conscious self.
To the knower.
Yes. But Krishna, in verse 7, seems to refute that. He says these attributes, desire, hatred, pleasure, pain, belong to the Katrama, to the non-self, the Anatma.
So they're modifications of the mind.
Modifications of the mind, yes. Vikaras. The sources even quote chapter 3, verse 34. Attachment and aversion for the objects of the senses abide in the senses. Let none come under their sway. So these feelings are properties of the field, not the knower.
That's a fundamental shift. It means the real you isn't inherently driven by desire or aversion, but just experiences them through the mind field.
That's the implication. The body-mind complex itself is called Sangataha, an aggregate, an assembly. And the sources say its special feature is that reflected consciousness, Padibimba Chaitanyam, and self-awareness, the I thought, or Ahamkara Vritti.
Chidabhasa.
Right, Chidabhasa. These are possible within this specific combination. But this animating principle, called Chetanam here, is considered part of the Kretram, and it's anityam, temporary, perishable.
Even intelligence and fortitude, Drithi, part of the field too.
Yes. Dhrithi, fortitude or will, is seen as a faculty of the Tretram, enabling action. And like everything else in the field, it's subject to the gunas. Chapter 18 talks about sattvic, rajasic, tamasic fortitude.
And emotions like anger, fear.
Also described as attitudes of the mind, antakarana dharma. They have fields of experience, things that arise within the kshetram. The true experiencer, the witness, is the kitrashna.
Okay. So the field is this vast, complex, changing thing, body, mind, intellect, ego, experiences, qualities. And the knower is the pure awareness behind it all. How does someone actually get this distinction? Not just intellectually, but really know it. The sources mention preparation.
Yes, there's a whole section on that. Verses 8 through 12 lists 20 qualities, values, attitudes.
20.
Yeah. And they aren't just presented as, be good. They're framed as prerequisites. Disciplines that mature the antakarana, the inner instrument.
The mind and intellect complex.
Right, to make it capable of actually grasping and holding this profound knowledge.
Let's touch on a few key ones highlighted in the sources. Humility, amanitvam.
The sources offer a nice perspective here. It's not just avoiding showing off, but internally the absence of self-praise, of demanding respect. True self-respect, they suggest, comes from knowing I am Atma Sat Chit Ananda, eternal conscious bliss.
When you know that, the need for external validation fades.
That's the idea, because all the temporary glories belong to the field, or ultimately to Ishvara.
Okay. Modesty adbam vitva.
Similar, but distinct. Absence of pretentiousness. Not putting on a show, claiming things you aren't. It often comes from a lack of self-acceptance, the sources say.
Non-injury ahimsa.
This goes beyond just physical harm. It's about not hurting through intention or even feeling. Cultivating sensitivity, seeing others' fullness, sympathizing, and avoiding double standards. It's okay for me to hurt others, but not okay for them to hurt me.
Right. Forgiveness kasanti.
The capacity to endure difficulties without getting upset internally, staying balanced when wronged, avoiding those knee-jerk reactions driven by the mind's fluctuations.
Purity, saicha, inner and outer.
Yes, inner purity is key, reducing strong attachments, raga, and aversions, devesha, anger, greed, jealousy. The sources mention prayer and pratipaksa bhavana.
Cultivating the opposite.
Exactly. Consciously generating the opposite positive emotion or habit. Outer purity is about keeping your environment conducive to mental order, essential for study, reflection, meditation. Sravanam, mananam, ninidhyasanam.
The garage versus temple analogy they use.
Yeah, a cluttered mind, like a messy garage, isn't great for deep work. A clean, ordered space, like a temple, is much better.
Steadfastness, sterya, and self-control, atmanigraha.
Sterya is commitment. Commitment to the goal of moksha, liberation, and also to your duties, karma yoga. That commitment helps neutralize the push and pull of likes and dislikes. Makes life itself a form of yoga. It means asking yourself regularly, where am I actually going?
And self-control.
Atmanigraha, mastery over the body-mind. Restraining it, filtering those desires and aversions. Pursuing liberation takes effort, the sources note, especially against inertia, tamas. Following the path of wisdom, sanmarga, is a form of this self-mastery.
Dispassion towards sense objects. Indriyarthesu virajyam, that sounds a bit austere.
The sources clarify it's not about hating things or forced suppression. It's about cultivating objectivity. Viraga is when the mind is just naturally free from intense longing. Viraga is objectivity achieved through inquiry, through prioritizing what truly matters.
Seeing things as they are, without projecting extra value onto them.
Exactly. Removing sapanadasa, the false projection of specialness. It's not aversion, but a recognition that sense objects don't hold the ultimate value compared to self-knowledge.
Absence of egoism and ahankara.
This is about that inner sense of I, me, mine. That feeling of self-importance, particularly at the thought level. It comes from forgetting that everything, all our abilities, our gifts, ultimately from Bhagawan, all glory belongs to the divine.
And then there's the one about seeing the downsides of worldly existence.
Yeah. Reflecting on the inherent suffering and limitations in birth, death, old age, sickness, pain. The idea is that clearly seeing these limitations of the field generates a genuine desire, an urgency for something beyond it, that divine field of perfection.
Non-attachment, asakti, and absence of obsession, anabhisvanga.
Asakti is about letting go of the sense of ownership, recognizing the body, mind, relationships are temporary trusts, not permanent possessions. Attachment, that intense mental clinging, inevitably leads to sorrow when things change.
And anabhisvanga.
That's specifically about excessive emotional dependence, especially regarding family, home. Love and care are natural, but the problem arises when we identify mine, my family, my possessions as me. That loss of boundary causes pain.
Constant equanimity, nityam samatitapam.
Keeping an even mind through desirable and undesirable outcomes, karma phala. A mind constantly reacting, bouncing between elation and despair, isn't available for learning. Composure, prasadabhuti, is needed. The sources make a nice distinction between care, which involves concern without pain, or dependence and attachment, which brings pain, dependence, and losing yourself in the object.
Okay, and the last two seem really central. Constancy in self-knowledge and seeing the end of true knowledge.
Yes. Adhyatma jnana nityatva. This isn't just getting the knowledge once, but living it. Constantly engaging with the understanding that the self, Atma, is Brahman. It means regular exposure to the teachings, deep analysis, mananam, sharing, integrating it, ninidhyasanam. The sources call this the most important virtue.
The medicine itself.
Right, while the other 19 are like the precautions that allow the medicine to work. And tapajnan arthagarsaman is keeping the goal in sight. Seeing the ultimate benefit of this knowledge, infinite freedom, the end of suffering samsara, constantly dwelling on the value of this pursuit.
So these 20 qualities cultivate the right inner environment. The sources also mention 3 key preparatory values.
Yes, they boil it down sometimes to viveka, vairaga, and bhakti. Viveka is discrimination, seeing that self-ignorance is the problem, self-knowledge is the cure. Vairagya is prioritization, making self-knowledge the top priority. And bhakti is devotion, seeking divine grace on the path.
And avoiding distracting socializing.
Arati jana samsari. Yeah, an absence of craving for social interactions that pull you away from the inner work.
Okay, so the ground is prepared. What then is the ultimate thing to be known, the Juneya?
The Juneya, according to verse 13 and the sources, is Brahman, the ultimate reality. And knowing Brahman leads to Amtam Asnut, attaining immortality.
Immortality, meaning deathlessness,
Yeah.
freedom from birth and death.
Yes, freedom from that cycle. And this Brahman is described as anadamat param, beginningless, supreme, eternal, beyond time itself.
How is it described further? It sounds so vast.
Verse 13 gives that famous description, na asat, neither being nor non-being in the usual sense.
Maybe.
Well, it's not non-existent because it's the very reality manifesting as everything, but it's also not an existent object that you can pinpoint or perceive like a pot or even a thought.
It's the subject.
It's the ultimate subject, revealed not by the senses or mind, but by sastra, the scriptures. It's called the causal upadi of all beings, the underlying reality. And immortality, the source's stress, isn't about the body living forever, but about rediscovering your true spiritual nature, which is already deathless. It's about ending the delusion of being finite and mortal.
Okay, that helps clarify. Not an object in reality, but the substance of reality. What other characteristics are mentioned?
Verses 15, 17, and 18 offer more descriptions. Verse 15 says, it appears to shine through the senses, sarva indriya guna pasa, but it's actually without senses, sarva indriya vivarjitam.
Like electricity in appliances.
Exactly. It empowers the senses and mind, but exists independently. The body-mind is just an upadi, a conditioning, like colored glass making clear light seem colored. Brahman itself is nirgunam without attributes, but appears sagunam. It's inactive, yet seems active. The sources quote the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. The self thinks, as it were, and shakes, as it were.
So it enables everything but remains untouched. What about its pervasiveness?
Verse 17, avipaktam kabuteshu, undivided in all beings, pervading everything like space. Yet vipaktam ivaka, it seems divided because of the different bodies and minds it illumines.
Like the electricity only showing up at the outlet.
Good analogy, yeah.
And it's both supporter and source.
Verse 17 again, buddhapatricha, supporter and sustainer. But also grasasnu pramavisnu ka, it devours and generates. It's the substratum, like the ocean for the waves or the waker for the dream, the ultimate source and the place of dissolution.
The light of all lights description in verse 18 is also very evocative.
Jyotisam api jyoti, yes. It's the ultimate illuminator. It illumines the sun, the moon, all external lights, but crucially, it also illumines our inner world thoughts, feelings, perceptions. It is the awareness principle, the subject.
The light by which everything else is known.
Exactly. Known intellectually, realized intuitively, the light within the heart, as the Brihadaranyaka says, it's self-luminous. The sources quote the Katha Upanishad. When he shines, everything shines after him. By his light, all these shine.
So Brahman is this ultimate beginningless, all-pervading, self-luminous reality. How does this specifically connect back to the knower of the field, that's Kshatrajna?
This brings us right back to the core message of verse 3. The Kshatrajna to be myself.
Myself, Krishna, the Supreme.
Yes. The Kshatrajna, the knower, the consciousness within your individual field, the microcosm, is that same supreme consciousness, the macrocosm. The sources put it very directly. I and you are essentially one at spirit level, not at matter level.
Okay, but our everyday experience feels so separate. Why do we feel like distinct individuals cut off from everything else?
That appearance of separateness, and indeed the appearance of all beings, arises from the conjunction, the samyoga, the apparent union of prakriti, the field, and purusa, the knower.
Apparent union.
Yes. Verse 20 says both prakriti and purusa are beginningless, but all the changes, the modifications, the qualities we see, they're born from prakriti. Purusa, the knower, is inherently asanga, unattached, unconnected.
But they seem connected.
They seem connected, and that apparent connection, that mix-up, is the cause of samsara, suffering. Verse 22. Verse 27 says, every being arises from this union of field and knower. But the sources emphasize it's not a real merging, it's a superimposition.
Like the snake in the rope now.
Yeah, exactly. A trick of the mind born of ignorance. Vedanta contrasts them clearly. Purusha is satyam, real independent. Nirvikara, changeless. Nirvikalpam, indivisible. Praktis is mithya, dependently real. Savikara, changing. Savikalpam, divisible, dependent.
The whole creation is prakriti.
And Purusha is what's left when you see through the illusion of Prakti's independent reality.
So the fundamental mistake, the root of suffering, is identifying with the wrong thing.
That's it, exactly. Identifying yourself, the Purusha, the eternal consciousness, with the temporary changing body-mind complex, which is Prakriti. That's the core problem.
That lays to
Anxiety about death, clinging to the body, struggling against aging, all the misery that comes from identifying with something inherently limited and perishable. The source used that analogy of a toxin.
Right, that the system keeps rejecting.
Yeah, it's an unnatural identification.
So the solution isn't trying to perfect the field, the body-mind.
Not ultimately. The only path to realizing your inherent immortality is shifting your fundamental sense of I away from the incidental body-mind to the intrinsic eternal consciousness.
And that requires knowledge.
Knowledge is key. To break free from that deeply ingrained sense of being mortal and limited, that's where Mahavakya deep inquiry into those great statements like Tat Trevam Asi comes in.
What's the payoff then? What's the vichara phalam, the fruit of this knowledge?
The biggest benefit, the sources say, is objectivity towards creation. When you know you are not the changing field, you can observe its natural processes, growth, decay, pleasure, pain, without identifying with them, without resistance.
Accepting the body as it is.
Accepting the body, its limitations, its eventual end, because your identity isn't invested there anymore. The swimming pool analogy comes back here.
Ah, yes. Without knowing how to swim.
The water prakriti seems dangerous, a source of sorrow, but once you know how to swim, understand its nature.
It becomes a sport. Enjoyable.
Exactly. Without this knowledge, life in the world is often suffering or just distraction. With the knowledge, life can be experienced as a sport, a play, something to be witnessed and even enjoyed from a place of detachment.
Living as the observer, not just the tossed-about participant.
Right. And verse 29 elaborates on this. One who sees the same Lord, the same Atma, equally present everywhere.
In everyone, everything.
Yes. That person does not destroy the self by the self, meaning they don't limit their true infinite nature by identifying with the small temporary ego bound to praktari.
And by not doing that.
They attain the highest goal. A jnani, one with this wisdom, sees their own self as non-separate from Ishvara. It connects to sayings like, the self is all this from the Upanishads. The feeling becomes, everything arises in me, exists in me, dissolves into me, there's no God separate from me.
And this knower, the self in the body, it doesn't actually do the actions.
Verse 32 confirms that. The supreme self, the dwelling in the body, neither acts, akarta, nor is tainted by the results, abhakta.
Actions belong to Prakti.
Actions are performed by Prakriti, driven by the gunas and the ego. BG 5.14 says this too. The Atma's role is just illumination, the silent witness.
Like the sun.
Verse 34 brings back the sun analogy. Just as one sun lights up the whole world, the one Paramatman, the knower in all fields, illumines the entire field. It's untouched by what it illumines.
So the final takeaway. Knowing this difference is liberation.
That's the essence of verse 35. Those who perceive this difference between kshetram and kshetrajna with the eye of wisdom, jnana chaksu, they attain liberation from prakti, from maya, from avidya, the cause of limitation.
Knowing the cause of the apparent difference frees you from it.
Exactly. Meditating on this relationship, the sources suggest, leads to experientially seeing the non-existence of the field as an independent reality and realizing your own infinite nature as the supreme self.
How does one gain this eye of wisdom? The sources mention different methods or paths.
Yes. Verse 25 outlines several approaches for Atmadarsanam, for beholding the self. One is dhyana yoga meditation.
Meditation, how does that work here?
It's described as beholding the self in the self by the self. It involves withdrawing the senses and mind inwards, contemplating the highest reality. It's often seen as an intuitive realization.
The meditator is the Atma.
Ultimately, yes. A prepared, quieted mind can perceive the self by the self. This involves nididhasanam, that deep, sustained contemplation that your inner self, pratigatma, is identical to Brahman. Sat Sit Ananjam, resolving the mind back into pure consciousness.
Does meditating on God with form help?
Saguna Brahma Upasana, yes. Meditating on Ishvara with attributes can be a powerful way to steady the mind, preparing it for the subtler, formless contemplation. The ultimate goal is seeing the Purna Atma, the whole unlimited self, by negating the false identifications and grasping the implied meaning, the Lakshartha.
Okay, what's another path mentioned?
Sankhya Yoga, the yoga of knowledge. Here, liberation is primarily achieved through Shravanam, listening attentively to the scriptures from a qualified teacher, and Vikara, deep inquiry, reflection, analysis.
More intellectual and reflective.
Yes. The sources say this path suits those who've already cultivated values like viveka, discrimination, and vairagya, dispassion, sama, tranquility, dhamma, sense control. Through this process, one comes to see the self as the eternal witness, distinct from the changing gunas of prakriti.
And karma yoga was listed too.
It is mentioned in verse 25 as a means to behold the self. While the sources here focus more on dhyana and sankhya for the beholding part, karma yoga was already established as crucial preparation. Acting selflessly purifies the mind, making it fit for knowledge or meditation, so it's integral to the journey.
And these paths align with other scriptures.
Yes, they connected to the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad's famous instruction. The self should be heard of, shravanam, reflected upon, mananam vikara, and meditated upon, ninitasanam dhyanam, often seen as stages.
The sources also included some stories to illustrate these ideas.
Yes, a few examples to show how this understanding might manifest. Jatayu, the vulture king.
Defending Sita.
Right. His story is presented as showing Kshatrajna awareness in action. He acted based on dharma, knowing his identity was the soul, not just the aging physical body. He chose noble action over self-preservation.
King Rantadeva.
His story emphasizes that true knowledge includes humility and service, not just intellectual pride. His deep compassion and selflessness, giving away his last bit of food while starving, shows bhakti in action, seeing the divine equally in all.
Hanuman's leap.
That illustrates how the body field is temporary and changeable, while real strength comes from the intellect and soul, closer to the knower. His power stemmed from devotion and inner focus, not just physical might. And Shabari,
Waiting for Rama.
her story shows that simple, unwavering devotion, humility, and surrender are also powerful paths to the supreme. It's not only about complex philosophy or rigorous meditation, heartfelt connection matters immensely.
Those stories really add a human element. Okay, so wrapping up our deep dive into Chapter 13,
So,
a core message.
fundamentally, Chapter 13, Kshetrajna Vibhaga Yoga, is about clearly understanding the distinction between the field, Kshetra matter, body, mind, the changing, and the knower, Kshetrajna spirit, consciousness, the unchanging. And the absolute core teaching is the oneness of the individual knower, Jiva, and the supreme knower, Paramatma.
Reality is Purusha and Prakriti, consciousness and matter, and the key is knowing you are Purusha.
Exactly. Purusha is satyam, real. Prakriti is mithya, dependently real. Suffering arises from identifying with Prakriti. The solution is knowledge, which leads to identifying correctly with Purusha.
And the result, the benefit.
Objectivity, freedom from suffering, being able to engage with life with all its ups and downs, not as a victim caught in the struggle, but as the conscious witness enjoying the play, like enjoying the sport.
And for listeners who want to read the chapter themselves, there was that practical note on translations.
Ah, yes. Gita Press was mentioned as popular. For deeper dives into traditional commentary, Bhanu Swami's translation incorporating insights from Vishwanatha Chakravarti and Baladeva Vidhibhushana was recommended. And the ISK-Con version is widely read.
Good to know. Well, this deep dive really hammered home that core idea from Chapter 13, who you fundamentally are, is that changeless knower, the consciousness observing everything, distinct from the ever-shifting field of body, mind, emotions, world.
And the sources consistently point out that by cultivating those values, those disciplines we talked about, and engaging with these paths, knowledge, meditation, you develop that eye of wisdom. You realize the distinction, and that realization itself is liberation from the suffering caused by mistaken identity. It's a profound shift.
So, a final thought for you listening. Just consider the different fields that make up your experience right now. Physical feelings, the flow of thoughts, emotions rising and falling, the situations around you. Which of these do you usually latch onto as me?
And what might it feel like just as an experiment to shift your focus, to rest back into the quiet awareness that's simply watching all that activity in the field? What would change if you approached life not primarily as the field being tossed around, but as the calm, conscious knower observing the field? Something to reflect on, perhaps.